Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Game Industry Insight, a look behind the scenes at game development. And be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future video topics. Alright, for today's discussion, this is actually going to be separated into two parts. A few months ago, I got a suggestion for a critical thought regarding when is it time to let a series die? Or when is it time to end a franchise? And as I thought about it, there are two major parts of this discussion. One is the idea of when to end a game, as in how long a game should be, and the other is what we just discussed. So for today, we're going to be doing an industry insight into when is it time to end a series, and then coming real soon, we're going to be doing a critical thought on how long should a game be. But the topic about sequels and franchises in the video game industry has been a long-standing one. We've used the term sequelitis many times before, and we've talked about the impact and the damage series fatigue can have on a studio, a brand, and of course on a publisher's checkbook. And this is one of those very weird dichotomies between the independent market and the AAA space. In an earlier topic, we talked about how risk-adverse AAA development is. When you have studios made up of 60-plus employees, millions of dollars in development overhead, and of course advertising and the publisher, you want every game to be a major winner. And because of that, publishers don't like untested theories or untested designs. And this is why, as we've shown, or as we've talked about, the independent market has really become this bastion for unique and original games. And in a very early critical thought, I think this was sometime maybe early last year or mid last year, I did a critical thought on the topic of why sequels are important to game design. And in that piece, I talked about how when it comes to developing a game, the first game is usually considered the test bed for the idea, the proof of concept to make sure that this design can be created, and more importantly, that there is a market for it. And then the sequel, sorry, I had to rub my eyes there, the sequel is when the developer basically has a chance to really make the game they wanted, in terms of taking the elements they weren't sure could fit or didn't have enough time to make, and left that on the cutting room floor. And over the last few years, we have seen some really big examples of series that have had an okay to good first game, and then hit it out of the park, or really go above and beyond with the second game. Some examples would be, of course, the jump from the original Far Cry to Far Cry 2, Grand Theft Auto, the originals to the Grand Theft Auto 3, Just Cause 1 to 2, and so on and so forth. Oh, and one major one, Assassin's Creed 1 to 2. And Assassin's Creed is a very important point. The first game was designed to be the proof or the test to see if this kind of paper doll UI and open world stealthish game could really thrive in the marketplace. And then with the second one, they just improved things dramatically. I remember seeing reviews of the first game being in like the low to mid 7s, saying, well, it's okay, I guess. Nothing much to write home about. And then the sequel just blew everybody away. It blew me away too, because I own both number 1 and number 2. And the second one, again, is just miles above. And this is why, when it comes to major franchises, if the first game really does knock it out of the park, expectations are really high for the sequel. Because if the first game was amazing and didn't feel like anything was left out, then, oh my goodness, what can they do with number 2? And the jump from Batman Arkham Asylum to Arkham City is another big example of that. And one that has got a lot of my friends and yours truly excited is Shadows of Mordor sequel, which Monolith has been teasing and talking about in video clips and interviews lately. The first game of that was amazing. Was it perfect? No. But what they did with the Nemesis system, especially for the first game, was really impressive. And if they can improve on that, oh man, I can't wait to try that one out. But, getting back to the topic at hand, while this is all well and good, of course, once a game or a series has become popular, publishers want to continue that. Because as we've talked about, A sequel is a known quantity. If your first game sold 3 million copies, then we can reasonably assume your second game should sell around that much. Not only that, but in terms of development, there we go, sequels are easier to develop than a brand new original concept. As we talked about, when you're developing a game for the first time, you still have to figure out if your game can even work within the specifications or limitations of your engine. With games 2, 3, 4, and 5, you have a much clearer idea as to your limitations and what you can and can't do. Hence why we see such a big improvement in the sequels. One of the biggest risks for game development is basically throwing everything and anything you've ever thought of into your first game. You don't know how things are going to work. You don't know if you can design it all. And this has led to many games just becoming overstuffed or just going into almost endless development time. And when it comes to the AAA market, again, once publishers have seen that a series works, they want to keep it going. However, though, there are a few big problems with this. First, from a story point of view. When it comes to game development, nothing is a known certainty. You don't know if the game you're working on is going to be a 10 million copy bestseller game of the year kind of game, or it's going to sell about 100,000 copies and no one's going to look at it. As we talked about on, I think, one of our discussions, like we said, if Grand Theft Auto ever sells only 100,000 copies, Rockstar Studios is closing. There's just no way they're going to keep going with something like that. But when it comes to developing a game, games are developed in as a single title or a single franchise. Because again, you don't want to create a game and tease 10 more games in the series to find out that no one's going to fund it. And we have seen games that have tried to overstep that. Here's a really good one that, for those of you watching this, I'm curious if I'm the only one who's played this game, and that is Advent Rising. This was essentially Mass Effect Point 5. It was written by, I think, a famous science fiction writer. I want to say Orson Scott Card, but I may be butchering that game, and I may be thinking of someone else entirely. It was going to be this magnum opus where you would choose everything and the story would evolve, and there was going to be multiple games and everything that you would do would affect the story. And then it did absolutely horrible in the market and the game was canceled after one title. But again, this was a game that was planned to have multiple titles in the series. In most cases, games are developed with an ending that will usually tie the story up and maybe leave room for a sequel if there is a possibility. But there are some exceptions, and speaking of Mass Effect would be one of those big ones. When BioWare announced Mass Effect and when they were talking about it, they had an idea this was going to be a 3-game story. And that is very unique when it comes to the game industry. Again, when you're developing a game, you're not thinking, 4 to 7 games down the line what you're going to do. You're focusing on things one game at a time. In many cases, that one game may be it. But when it comes to developing things in terms of a sequel, from a story perspective, this is where the weaknesses of video games in terms of telling very long-lasting stories come into play. Because on one hand, each game has to wrap up the story or people are going to get pissed off. But on the other hand, you also have to leave things open enough for a sequel. The Diablo franchise is a good example of that. In each game, we basically save the world from a catastrophic demonic invasion by Diablo, and then it just so happens he has a plan B, C, and D for each new expansion and sequel. Now, with that said though, from a gameplay perspective, this is when things get even more interesting in terms of talking about series fatigue. When it comes to designing a sequel to a game, there's a very fine line between making a game that is similar enough to the first game, but still different enough to basically warrant its development, versus making a game that is so similar, you're basically just playing the same game. And we've seen cases, sadly, where developers will basically play it too safe, and people are left wondering, well, why should I buy your second game when your first game does everything that your second one is doing? But as we've said, there are cases where the second game just completely radically changes the design. Payday being a really good example of that. The work that Overkill has done from Payday 1 to Payday 2 and where it is now, it's just a fundamentally different game. Completely different progression models, how the weapons work, how the heists were designed, etc. In this case, the sequel just basically overshadows the first game. And this is one of those very weird things about game development. Because of, as we said, how games iterate in terms of their design, many cases the previous games in the series become superseded by the latest iteration. And this is especially true of sport, or as we've seen with the yearly iterations of Call of Duty. Once a new Call of Duty game comes out, or a new Madden, or FIFA, or you name it, the previous game basically gets, thrown into the bargain bin. Because why should you play the older game when the new game, of course, has the latest revisions and the latest iterations on the design? But the question remains, how long can you keep this going? Assassin's Creed is certainly beginning to show examples of this in terms of franchise fatigue. We are up to, I don't know. We talked about this on the live cast, I think it was last week, but I honestly can't keep track of how many Assassin's Creed games there are. Same thing goes for Kingdom Hearts. But when it comes to Assassin's Creed, the base gameplay has not really changed all that much. They've added in new subsystems and new things to do in the world, but the foundation of the game has remained the same. And no matter how many times they can alter the story of Templars versus Assassins, I mean, how long are people going to keep buying the game? Now, with that said, of course, multiplayer is a completely different beast. And I'm also going to be saying that when we talk about the length of a game in the upcoming Critical Thought. So, unfortunately, we won't be bringing that into today's discussion. Now, with that said, though, there's one other major point in terms of series fatigue or keeping a series going. And this goes back to what I said way back at the beginning of today's Critical Thought, or I'm sorry, Industry Insight. And that's the dichotomy between indie and AAA. As we spent the last 12 minutes talking about, AAA development prefers sequels. They want to have a known estimate of the popularity of a series, how much it should make, and stuff like that. But when it comes to independent development or indie developers, we rarely see sequels to games. And we can see this with a lot of the big name games that have come out over the last few years. Again, if Gone Home was developed by a AAA company, I would bet we will have heard of a Gone Home 2 or a Gone Home 3 by now. The same goes for Firewatch, for Stardew Valley, Undertale, and so on. But one of the things that I especially have learned from talking to independent developers, especially when they finish like going through an early access or the entire development cycle, is that very rarely are things left on the cutting room floor for a sequel. Because of how passionate and just how focused independent developers are at getting everything they want into their games, there is rarely anything left over that they could reasonably turn into a sequel. A game, for instance, like Undertale, like something like that, you can tell that the developer put everything and anything they had into making Undertale. Like, I can't imagine, what's his name, Toby Fox, I think? I can't imagine him just leaving out an entire section of the game and saying, well, we'll save that for an expansion. Now, that said, though, things can be cut. And the decision making behind leaving or cutting elements from game design, that's another topic easily. But when it comes to independent development, another thing has to be the fact that many independent developers spend a lot more time on developing a game. This is partly due to the fact that we're dealing with smaller teams, and of course by the fact that they are usually creating unique experiences. And when it comes to creating something that's unique, it's very hard to think about this in terms of, well, I'm going to make this into a 5-game series. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, such as Five Nights at Freddy's and what we've seen with Outlast. But for the most part, a lot of the indie games that I've enjoyed over the last few years, stuff like Renowned Explorers, The Swapper, and again, it's one of those topics that my mind blanks because there's just so many games. It's very hard to imagine a developer basically striking the same magic twice or getting hit by lightning twice with these games. And that's another major risk of the independent market. If you put everything you have into one game, can you repeat that success? Or can you even make it more? And for a lot of development, especially for a lot of indie games like this, there's usually not much more you can go with these ideas, unless you risk, of course, radically changing the game to the point that no one recognizes it, or it's seen as, you're misleading the audience. That this isn't the sequel to this game, it's a completely different title. Now, with that said, though, for those of you watching this, and this is a special question for the indie developers, for those of you who have finished games on itch.io, Steam, whatever, have you thought about making sequels to that idea? Or if you've decided against it, what was the reasoning for it? And like I said, when it comes to independent development, one of the things that we've seen also is the fact that, one of the things that we've seen when it comes to independent development are developers trying to position themselves as a brand rather than as being known for a specific genre. Like we said with AAA departments or AAA games, when you think of DICE Interactive from EA, I'm sure you think first-person shooters. When we think of Blizzard, you probably think of Overwatch or World of Warcraft or Diablo. When it comes to the independent scene, developers seem to want to become more known for the studio. A really good point, or a really good case in point, would be Clay Entertainment, who over the last 5 or 6 years have put out some of my favorite games from the independent space. And each one is just radically different. You can't tell me that Don't Starve plays the same way as Invisible Ink, which plays the same way as Oxygen Not Included. And instead of, again, being known as just the Don't Starve guys or the Invisible Ink people, they're known more for making these quality games. And this is a major point about marketing yourself. Because once you've established yourself as being a quality and reputable studio, that can carry on into your next game and your next and so on. And this way, it's not as important to be just cranking out the same game or the same kind of design. But if you're known to be very successful and making great games, then that can afford you a lot of clout. Like I've said earlier, or in an earlier discussion, you know that the millisecond that the Chinese Room announces a possible sequel to Gone Home, or if Scott announces another Five Nights at Freddy's game, that every major outlet is going to cover that, because the branding is there for that developer. Now, with that said, though, I know we are approaching 20 minutes, but there is one other topic I want to talk about when it comes to franchise fatigue and combating it. And that goes back to the AAA market. Like I just said, when it comes to indie versus AAA, indies tend to put everything they have into one game, and then the brand or the studio becomes the prime motivator. The AAA market tends to focus on series and franchises. But there are some exceptions to this. And we've seen some AAA developers, again, become more about the brand rather than specifically or strictly about the design. And the two big examples of this would be Nintendo and Blizzard. We've, of course, have talked about Nintendo many times over on these series, or on these video series. And Nintendo has become very much brand-centric. Again, we know there's always going to be another Mario, or another Zelda, or another Metroid. Hope, fingers crossed on that one, in the works somewhere. And what they do is they tend to keep the basic DNA of these games intact, but you never know the exact details or the growing from these mechanics that's going to go into these titles. Super Mario 64, Super Mario World, and Super Mario Galaxy are all platformers, but their unique designs and formula makes each game different. The same goes for Zelda. We all know when we play a Zelda game the basic idea. Zelda's going to be in trouble. There's going to be a Master Sword, and and I think we can all pretty much guarantee that Ganon will somehow be responsible for all the bad stuff. But what we're doing in these games, from dungeon design to the tools we'll use to even just the foundation of the overworld, is going to be completely different. Final Fantasy would be another major example of this. Each Final Fantasy game is similar by name alone, and sometimes by the characters in it, like Cid. But the RPG systems are always different in each one of the games, along with the story and the world and the lore. Like I said, there's going to be some knowns. Like, we're going to hear that music for at least 300 to 500 times at some point in the game. But what we're going to be doing in it, the side quests, and how the combat plays out, will be different. Now, of course, that goes back to the challenge or the risk of developing a game like this. With each new Final Fantasy game, Square Enix is basically starting at zero again, which is why they take so long to develop, as opposed to something like Grand Theft Auto or Battlefield or Call of Duty, where you already have a fixed foundation in place. With that said, though, this may turn to a 40-minute discussion if I don't stop this now. But when it comes to series fatigue or franchise fatigue, this is a major point when it comes to AAA developers. And I think in my opinion, no matter how well you do, unless you are like a company like Nintendo or Blizzard or something like Square Enix, there is a fixed limit in terms of how much you can get out of a franchise. And I think that is dependent on the mechanics and the design. You can only do so much with a first-person shooter, or a platformer, or a open world game. And at some point, you're just going to be repeating yourself. And no matter how much publishers want it, I don't think series like this are going to be, getting into like Assassin's Creed 15 or Battlefield 10 or anything like that. At some point, you're going to run out of ideas. And at that point, you're going to have to do something different. And again, this is where things get very interesting in terms of basically starting over with a brand new series and concept, but maybe using elements from your previous game or your previous foundation, but going in a different direction. But with that said, we're going to wrap it up here. Like I said, we're going to stay tuned for a critical thought on the topic of how long should games be. Because, oh my goodness, we're about 23 minutes into this one. That could be another 20 minutes easily. And thank you so much for sticking through to the end of this video. If you are new, be sure to like and subscribe. And check back daily for more discussions of design here and on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. And if you have a topic for a future vlog, please let me know. But otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I will catch you all next time. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.